Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our March presentation from the Racial Equity Ministry team. We're really delighted that all of you are here, and sorry that everybody else who isn't here is missing a really wonderful opportunity. And hopefully there will be people who will listen to the recording, because I think they're missing an excellent opportunity. And so thank you all for coming. Thank you again, Brian and New Life, for your hospitality. And I want to thank you all over the many course of months for free will offerings that help us to continue to provide the hospitality snacks for these events. So, my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Michael Guéno, who is an associate professor of philosophy and religious studies at UW-Whitewater, and his specialty is in religion and particularly Native religions and connection to contemporary issues. So today that's what he will be talking to us about, the circle and broken Native American religions and restorative justice, which is an important topic. So, okay. Michael.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. It is a pleasure and an honor to get to speak to anyone who actually wants to be here. I'm a college teacher, so it's a rare opportunity for me. Well, the topic for today, and I seem to have lost that clicker they gave me. Oh well. Hey, there we go. So the topic for today, I said, was going to be Native American religions and restorative justice. That is the focus. However, when preparing for the lecture, when preparing for this little get-together, I took a look at some of the previous talks that have been online, read up on the commission, read up on the Lutheran Church that this is in conversation with, to see where this Racial Equity Committee is sort of oriented and what we're trying to bring about here. I listened to some of your wonderful talks, including the last talk on Native American experience, and realized that there seemed to be something that I thought needed to be played up a little bit more, and was kind of surprising that we haven't talked about it. And that is the role of religion in bringing about the current state of things. The role of religion in the creation of this situation of racial inequity, the current state of racial injustice. And so today we're going to talk about Native American religions and how that served as a focus for the creation of racial relations, how religion has been at the heart of all of the history between the races, and specifically between Native Americans and non-natives. So with that said, Native American religion is what I ultimately want to get to, but it can't be where we start. It can't be just a beginning, here's Native American religion 101. Because the very concept of Native American religion is tied into the identity of Native Americans. The creation of Native Americans as an identity is tied into the emergence of the concepts of race here in Western culture. So we've got to talk a little bit broader first. The history, the origin of racial injustices. Let's start small. Native Americans. All right. Where'd they come from? Asia. All right, how'd they get here? Land bridge. Everyone knows it, right? Why was that the answer to the question?
I watched a program on PBS just
And that's the one we're told, right? It's one I got from like grade school all the way up. Everyone knows they came across from the land bridge and they got to America. But why was that a sufficient answer? They came across the land bridge, so that would have been Russia. Before that, they came from Asia. Well, before that, they would have come from further west and eventually from Africa. Why was it sufficient to answer the question just to connect them in some way back to the other landmass? In part, it's because our very concept of Native Americans still participate in the same acts of cultural misunderstanding and cultural violence that Columbus did when he was on the boat. When he came here, he encountered people that he understood could be nothing other than Asian, right? Setting sail to the west, he eventually came to a landmass, believing these people to be the same people as those in Asia he was seeking to trade with. He called them Los Indios, right? The Indians, which just meant anyone who was east of the Indus River Valley. In his worldview, how could it have been otherwise? He believed, as did most Europeans, that there is one God who created one humanity in one event of creation. Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, which means every human being that is on this planet is in some way a descendant of those people. For these people to have not been Asians, it would have thrown that entire religious worldview into question. He had to find some way to situate these people into that religious worldview. He did them by understanding that they were Asians. Now, several trips later, Columbus came to realize that he, in fact, did not discover Asia, but some very large landmass, a very big island. It still would not be a continent, but it was a very, very big island. So the question, how did they get here? In some way, they had to tie into his Christian worldview. They had to be situated in some way into the biblical narrative. So he understood these people as being in some ways the descendants of those first people cast out of the Garden of Eden. In some way, they are descendants of Adam and Eve, and so this place, if it's not a part of the world that we knew before, must be a part of the world that we've lost. Well, we lost the Garden of Eden. We don't know where it is. I must have found it. So these people in some way must be living closer to that long-lost Garden of Eden, and in some way must be connected to that earlier version of humanity. Later on, as people came to explore this big island, realize it was an even larger landmass, eventually become known as a continent, they kept trying to understand and situate the people that they found here within their worldview, discovering them maybe as the lost tribes of Israel, especially as we came into contact with Native Americans in Central America and saw that they were able to build huge cities out of stone, do grand works of architecture and engineering. If these Native Americans were savages, as they were referred to, it would be impossible for them to do this. So there had to be some sort of other respectable injection into this culture. Well, we don't know where the lost tribes of Israel went, so obviously this is where they ended up. They were able to do these things before sort of losing their way and losing their cultural advancements and somehow devolving into the natives that we have today. Religion was a part of the creation of Native Americans. As we continued to try to understand them, we invented a place for them within our Christianity. It went hand in hand with the creation of Native Americans as a race. Race is a larger concept, but even the creation of the concept of race is a result of Christian interaction with peoples of the world. When you grew up, how many races were there? 5, 4? Wow, nice. There were really 2 for me. I grew up in a non-desegregated school parish, and growing up, that meant that there were only 2 relevant races, really, that there was black and non-black. There could have been others on other school tests, but there were really 2 that were relevant. Other people grew up and there was white and black, and other times we divided that up into 4 or 5, and it depends on what decade you're from. race is always sort of a made-up category. And we say it's based off of something biological. Exactly. The invention of race was a product of Europeans coming into contact with Africans who they'd known about for centuries. They'd been living alongside for centuries, but needed some way to be able to better understand and justify enslavement of Africans. And so we see this creation of blackness. And blackness then created whiteness in opposition as sort of counterposed to a sort of third category, which was either Muslim or Asian. So we are civilized, we are therefore white, we are good and Christian. The opposite of us must therefore be black, which must be uncivilized, which must be savage. And then you got a third category that's kind of them and kind of us, and it would be like the Muslims, they're a barbaric nation. They're a nation, but they're still a barbaric one. Or maybe we could be talking about Far Asia, where again, they live in cities, they're civilized, but they're not Christian, they're kind of savage. There's always this sort of three-point scheme. To understand Native Americans was essentially to try to figure out where they fit in this scheme. Did y'all ever cover why it was okay to enslave Africans, scripturally? Where did they fit in?
They told me there's something about an arrow in the Old Testament, somebody way back, some warrior story.
It's Old Testament. Children of Ham. Yeah. Noah got off the boat, got drunk, got naked, passed out. Good story. And his son, Ham, laughed at his naked, drunken father, and for this was cursed by God to be the servant or slave of his brethren, as would his descendants. So as we tried to understand these African people, we came to understand that they were situated within the scriptural narrative as in some ways descendants of Ham, which means it is God's will that they be servants and slaves of the rest of us. Native Americans are going to need to be situated and understood within this religious context, and they will be. But it's also going to be religion that serves as the focus for interactions by Euro-Americans and these native people. It's going to be conflict over their religion that's going to be at the heart of the identity of what makes natives natives. Beginning with the Spanish. When the Spanish began to lay claim to what is now Central America, and part of Florida, and move on up into California, and Arizona, and New Mexico, they were able to lay claim to these territories because they had received permission by God's agent here on earth, the church, as represented by the Pope at the time, right? Divine right of kings. Kings have power because God gives them power. How does God give them power? Well, he gives them power through his agent, the church, and through its representative, the Pope. So kings and queens owned this land because God gave it to them, because the Pope said God gave it to them. They were able to claim new territories in North America only because they received official papal permission. In the permission that Spain, Portugal, and later France were given, it was a conditional permission. They could lay claim to these territories on the condition that they evangelize the natives, that they bring them Christianity and try to convert them to Christianity. If they didn't do that, they did not receive permission of these new lands. So to create Spanish colonialism meant that in addition to soldiers, you had to bring in missionaries. You had to make a good faith effort at trying to convert the natives. Whether you succeeded or not didn't matter as much. And so to lay claim to territory, to reap the natural resources, went hand in hand with an agenda of trying to bring Christianity to these people, which in the Spanish understanding of Christianity was to make them Spanish. It was understood that to be Christian was to be Spanish. So if we make them act like they're Spanish, they will naturally become Christian. So make them live in cities, make them speak Spanish, make them wear shirts with roughly laces at the collars, and then naturally their heart will become Christian. And then once their heart is Christian, they will naturally want to use their labor for the good of the Spanish Empire. It's just the way things worked, whether or not that actually worked. And so all of the negative things we might hear coming out of Spanish colonialism is because of this. It's the idea that you can affect a change on a person's outward behavior, and that once they live that life, naturally their heart or spirit would convert. It was an effort to sort of wrought Christianity into their very souls. When the French laid claim to North America, what is now New France, both Louisiana territories and especially Quebec, it came with the same condition: evangelize the Native American. Their understanding of Christianity was a little bit different. They thought you needed to change the heart of a person first, and that the outer person would then convert. And so we get a different experience within Native American communities. Instead of having soldiers forcing them to live in one place in French territories, they were allowed to keep their largely nomadic lifestyle. It didn't hurt that that lifestyle was able to then contribute to the France economic bottom line, because the colony was built off of trading and trapping of furs. It helped. So instead of forcing them to live in missions, the French Jesuits went and began to live among the natives. This is a very different experience. It seems to present a kinder, gentler form of evangelism. Certainly, it did lead to that quite often. These Jesuits put time into trying to understand the native people that they were seeking to convert. They came to learn some of their language, learn some of their basic religious concepts, so that they could then use those concepts to undermine the native society. Use those language terms so that you could better present Christianity in a concept that they would find easily acceptable. So it's learn about your subjects so that you can destroy it. Creates a long-lasting memory within native communities, for French and within English people thereafter, that if you allow outsiders to know too much about your privileged secrets, your privileged rituals, the stuff that you find important and sacred, it's only going to be used to more efficiently dismantle your society. Puritans, different group, English, Protestant, still Christian, and still have a focus on trying to convert the Native Americans here. Part of their settlement of the American Northeast was Reformation. The other part was evangelization. In part, they thought that they could come to North America and create a sort of ideal utopia that would show all of those Christians back in Europe what real Christianity is. And once they saw real Christianity, Puritan Christianity, they would naturally convert their wicked European decadent ways and become Puritan. We, Puritans, then are now God's chosen people, the new Israel that's going to show the rest of Christendom the future that God would have for us. Well, if we are God's new people, not God's new Israel, then just like Israel, we are being brought into a wilderness to be tried and tested. So North America becomes the wilderness just as the desert was for the Hebrews. This wilderness is not empty. It has natives, and so the native people came to be understood as an expression of the wilderness. The wilderness is that which is the opposite of God. It is used by God, but it's not the same thing as God. It's something that's going to lead us into a time of trial, something that we have to struggle against. And in struggling against it, we will be purified and transformed into his people. That's fine if you're talking about abstract trees and forces of nature. But when you understand the native peoples as that wilderness that you must struggle against, sure, the Puritans tried to convert the native people, but again, the results didn't matter near as much as the effort. The effort of trying to bring them Christianity was a presentation of our Christianity. It was us doing our Christianity. It was us showing the wilderness that it will not win. The fact that the wilderness might resent it and attack us for doing so, that just made it better, because we all know life should be hard. That the world should be against us as Christians. So if the Native Americans don't receive this Christianity, in some ways it's proof positive that we are doing what is right. Didn't exactly lead to great relationships. Birth of America. We get a more rational, scientific basis, and not just Christianity, but even the rational Enlightenment foundation of our understandings of peoples was inherently based off of Christianity. Protestantism, more so than Catholicism, began to emphasize that all you need is your God-given reason and scripture to discern truth. You don't need tradition. So as long as we can all agree to use reason and use it properly, we can all come up with the same answers. Mm-hmm. So when trying to define races, we don't need to appeal to scripture. We can do it rationally. We can do it scientifically. We can do it based off of something that everyone can observe and say biology. But these categories were inherently based off of those normative and religiously based categories. During the early republic, as far as interactions with Native Americans, the main goal was just to get them not here, whether it be to treat with them, to buy land, simply encourage them to leave elsewhere. The focus was just to get them out of those lands that would be claimed and tamed and civilized by Americans. Part of that rational focus of the Enlightenment gave North Americans a new way to understand why Native Americans needed to be displaced. Now it wasn't just that God gave us this land and so it is ours. Now it is that Native peoples are somehow degenerate for not having put up fences. Putting up fences, tilling the land, making permanent structures was signs of quote-unquote improving the land, showing dominion of the land, laying claim to a land. God sent us into the world and told us to claim this land and exert dominion over it. So you can only claim a land if you have exerted that dominion, if you've put part of your life, your effort into it. If you can show that you've put part of your life and effort into it by erecting permanent structures, divvying it off from other parts of land by building fences, creating permanent fields, creating permanent structures. Native Americans didn't do that, which means that somehow they are just lazy for not doing it. Regardless, they don't have a right to claim it as their own, and they need to get off of it so that we who do want to be virtuous and industrious can claim it as our own. Eventually, Native American presence becomes too much of a discomfort for Euro-American settlers. And since the time of Thomas Jefferson, there's the idea of Indian removal floating around American politics. That as long as Native Americans are still living in and among American cities, there's not going to be peace between us. That unless Native Americans can be separated somehow from non-Native Americans, no one's going to be happy. No one really took that idea too seriously. It made movement on it, though, until Andrew Jackson. And that suggestion eventually became law, and we get a forced policy of Indian removal. Remove all of those Native Americans that are still found within claimed American territories and move them out of it. And then move them further still as America kept claiming new territories, eventually moving them west of the Mississippi River. And those natives that didn't automatically accept any previous offer for their land would be encouraged and then eventually mandated. And we get all of the tragedies that y'all have spoken about before, most notably the Trail of Tears. This policy from the early American Republic through the mid-1800s The policy that we had related to Native Americans was called the war policy. We existed as a nation, as a people, in a state of ongoing war with all Native nations. Because if they did not enter into alliances with us, if they did not yield to Euro-American authority, they rejected our authority and therefore were antagonistic, or at least that's how we interpreted it. So that we are to remove them by any means possible, peaceful negotiation if possible first. If that doesn't work, encourage them forcefully. If that doesn't work, exterminate them. And that is the proper legal term, extermination. And as we began to claim territories in quote-unquote Indian territory, those areas west of the Mississippi, the war policy became encouraged, and we got Native American affairs to be managed by the War Bureau, where Native Americans were to be excerpted off of land through military force to wipe out entire villages. Why? Because they weren't American. Why weren't they American? Because they were Native. And part of what was going on here was an assumption of religious identity. Although America wasn't necessarily founded on explicitly religious ideas, never says that you need to be a Christian to be an American. The assumption was that Native Americans were not Christian, and therefore they could not be American. By rejecting Christian values, they were rejecting American values. After a series of devastating massacres in the Colorado Territory, Christian reformers back east start to care about Native Americans. They start to see what is happening and be truly moved by devastation being wrought by our nation's policies. They lobby the U.S. government to change its policy from a war policy to what gets created, the peace policy. In the 1860s, the peace policy is introduced. In 1869, the Board of Indian Commissioners is created by the United States government to oversee the settlement of Native American people on established reservations, to encourage their permanent residence, their non-nomadic lifestyles, and encourage them to pick up a lifestyle that is more compatible with American values. Make them live as farmers. Make them live in one place. Make them accept ideas like personal property and all of those things that we think are the foundation of American values. Personal property, apparently. And the idea that we don't work together, that we farm our individual plots of land and not collective plots of land. As part of the settlement process, we get the agreement to give annuities to those who settle on reservations, promises that usually don't get kept. When Native Americans didn't just die off on their reservations, as was hoped for, further actions were needed. Further actions were needed to encourage Native Americans to essentially become Americans. That was the thinking behind the peace policy. It wasn't that extermination should stop. It's just that we should shift to a kinder, gentler form of extermination. Whereas the war policy tried to kill Native Americans to get rid of them, the peace policy said explicitly that our goal was to kill the Indian to save the man. It was the idea that if to get rid of Native Americans, you have to get rid of the Native American within them. That means to get rid of their values, to make them accept American and Christian values. And since this wasn't happening naturally, we get a series of laws coming from the Board of Indian Commissioners to encourage this process, including in 1883, the passing of the ban, which outlawed the practice of Native American religions. In this country in 1883, we outlawed the practice of Native American religions, Native American rituals. That is a ban that did not lift officially until 1932, but didn't lift in its reality fully until 1954. 2 years later, after the ban was initiated, the Dawes Act came out. The Dawes Act was a series of rules that went along with the Allotment Act of 1887 that were focused on trying to reintegrate Native Americans into American society, or to fully integrate Native Americans into American society. That is, destroy all parts of them that makes them different from other Americans. As part of the Dawes Act is the well-known boarding school policy. Have y'all talked about that yet?
Yeah.
So in those boarding schools, after we take children from their parents, send them away, we taught them the value of rejecting their traditional authorities, disrespecting their parents, their elders, and especially their religious leaders. We taught them the values that we thought were the heart of America, from liberty and democracy to private property to the importance of holding an occupation or service job. We taught them a trade, which mainly meant making the Native community do manual labor, physical exercise, so that they would be well trained at lifting heavy objects. And it meant that we forcibly taught Christianity. These boarding schools were religious schools. The Board of Indian Affairs was run by predominantly two Christian bodies, the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church. Between the two of them, they divvied up the reservations throughout America, choosing who would control which one. Those who served on the Board of Indian Commissioners were generally leaders within their Christian community. And the person who would be in charge of a reservation was typically whatever minister was sent there to run the local mission. These boarding schools just encouraged that process of forced conversion. At these schools, as part of becoming America, they were to be forcibly taught Christianity. This forced boarding school process doesn't end until the 1970s. Which is to say that we are still experiencing the repercussions of that within the Native community and within America today. We still have people living today who were separated from their parents and forced to go to these boarding schools. There are people today who have lost their children because they were sent to boarding schools and we don't know what happened to them. Many died, others ran away. Children were just lost. In an attempt to, in some ways, recognize past failures, the American Indian Policy Review Committee passed a resolution in 1974, AIRFA, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. It tried to, and I'm going to read this to get the language right. It tried to protect the religious rights, traditional religions, and cultural practices of American Indians, Eskimos, Aleuts, and Native Hawaiians. So trying to finally recognize that some of these religious rights and practices have not been recognized or protected, especially a failure since 1934 when all Native Americans were forcibly made into U.S. citizens, yet still denied religious freedom. AIRFA went on to recognize that the rights of Native Americans include, but are not necessarily limited to, access to sacred sites, freedom to practice ceremonial and traditional rites, and the use and possession of sacred objects, and thus the repatriation of those objects and the bones of their ancestors that have up until now been interred within general museums. It's a good first start. Unfortunately, AIRFA was toothless. It lacked any measures to actually enforce these general moral resolutions. And so the House Committee, let's see which House Committee. The House Committee on Natural Resources and a subcommittee on Native American Affairs met and in 1994 introduced H.R. 4155 to amend AIRFA. It seeks to ensure that federal lands be managed in such a way as to not impede or frustrate traditional religions and the religious purposes of Native Americans. It doesn't exactly define what that means or to what extent one might wish to manage those lands in such a way to not frustrate them. And it puts in a caveat that one should not try to frustrate Native practices unless it is absolutely necessary or unless the general will of the people makes it required, essentially eminent domain. H.R. 4230 was similarly introduced to allow access to peyote within bona fide Native American religious ceremonies. There have been actions taken, these actions, later actions, to try to allow Native American religions a place within our society, to no longer target them as objects to be eliminated, as has been the historical practice between Euro-Americans and Native people. Unfortunately, the Bill of Rights does guarantee certain religious freedoms in one of those amendments. Which amendment? Second, yes, good. No one in my classes knows that. In the Second Amendment, we actually do grant certain religious liberties. In the Second Amendment, religion is mentioned in two separate clauses. You've got the Free Exercise Clause and the No Establishment Clause. Free exercise says that all people are entitled to the free exercise of their religion. That means, as we've defined it in U.S. law, that you have the right to reach, hold, and change your conscience according to the dictates of your conscience. We have defined the practice of religion as your ability to believe anything you want. The government, of course, can interfere when necessary or when it desires upon those actions that flow from those beliefs. So this is problematic because this very concept of religion is the concept of religion found within European and American cultures, a concept of religion based off of Christianity. Christianity, more than any other religion, has emphasized belief. Both Islam and Judaism are far more about practice than belief. In fact, there are some forms of each that as long as you are doing the right thing, it really doesn't matter so much what you believe. But in Christianity, in addition to doing the right thing, you need to believe the right thing. So of course, in America, when we came to define and try to figure out what religion means, we said that religion is about belief. When we turn to Native American cultures, and start to study Native American religion, if we're going to allow Native American religions to be freely practiced, what are Native American religions? We find that most Native American cultures don't have a word for religion. It is just not an indigenous concept. It's a European concept. And so when we go to study Native American religions, when I come up here to talk about Native American religion, I am doing, in fact, an act of cultural violence. I'm approaching a people and grouping some things together that have no inherent meaning, separating some practices from other practices, some beliefs from other beliefs, grouping some rituals, some aspects of culture as being meaningfully grouped together and saying they are somehow other than the other parts of culture. It's simply not a part of the way most Native Americans understand their way of life or what they would call religion. And certainly, belief is not at the heart of it. It is an entire way of life. Before I can speak more about Native American religion, I have to recognize the myth of the Native American that's always floating in the room. That whenever I say Native American, or when I say Native American religion, we tend to have a picture pop into our head, right? Some sort of stereotypical image, usually informed by Hollywood from the 50s and 60s. Or great American art, right? That classic image of probably a Native American on a horseback riding towards the sunset, leathers, feathers. The problem is not only that that image was not characteristic of Native American life for most people or for most of history. It's the fact that in our mind, a picture comes. A picture of usually a Native American. And there was no such thing. There was no such culture as Native American culture. Native American people were an incredibly diverse group that are only lumped together because an outside culture lumped them together and said, y'all are all the same thing. There were, within North America at the moment of European contact, at least 250 discrete Native American languages. That means a language that if you know one, you can't understand the other. Some numbers put that, some estimates put that number closer to 1,000. And you can imagine the necessary level of cultural variation you would have to be able to sustain that many distinct and diverse languages. In terms of population, we don't know. But at the moment of European contact, there was an estimated population here in just North America of probably all of Europe and Russia at the time combined. So there is no one native culture, there is no one Native American religion. And in terms of religion and culture, the Native peoples varied incredibly and across the board. But that said, we can make some oversimplifications, some generalizations, because frankly, I get paid to teach Native American religion, and I like to have a job, so I've got to have something to say. So there is no native word for religion, but maybe if we take a look at all of those world cultures that are in the similar boat, that don't have a concept for Native American religion, and allow those cultures to instead inform our concept of religion, we can start to look at something different. And certainly, Native Americans have some way in which they make real the universe as they understand it. And that's going to include beliefs, but also those practices that we do that affirm for us the worldview that we have. Certainly, Native Americans are going to have relationships between each other, and they're going to have beliefs and practices that help themselves understand their place within their own self, their place within their local community, within the local landscape, within the universe itself. And we can start thinking of religion in that sort of larger framework, and there's certainly something that we can say about Native American religion. And that is that it is centrally based off of relationality. When I ask most Americans today what is at the heart of their religion, they either say their self, like the religion of spirituality and self-growth, or they'll say God or Jesus. Because generally my students are Christian, and so they'll say God or Jesus is at the heart. There are spiritual beings within most Native American religions, but I would say the heart isn't those beings, nor is it us. It is the relationship between. Relationality is what defines this entire universe. This world, this physical world and everything beyond, is one big interwoven network of kinship bonds. To know how you are to behave in a given interaction, you need to understand the proper familial relationship that binds you with the other. There's a way that you are expected to treat your mama, right? We may or may not do it, but there's a way we all know you're supposed to treat your mama. And it's different than the way you're supposed to treat your dad. And it's a little bit different than the way you're supposed to treat your grandma, which is different from your grandparent, and so on. And you know how to treat a given person based on how you are related to them. Likewise, everyone in this village, everyone in this community can be understood in some way as a correlation of those familial relationships. Do we treat this person like a grandmother, or do we treat them like an aunt? Is this person to be respected like a father or loved like a mother? Same too, we are related to all of those non-human entities that are a part of our world. They too are our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our grandmothers. We know how to treat them when we understand the proper family relationship that binds us together. If we treat the son as a father, we can expect that the son would then treat us as a dutiful son. If we treat the rattlesnake as a cousin, not rile it up and step on it, when it gets angry, leave it alone, like you do your cousins, then it will treat us like a cousin and just not randomly attack us. And before it attacks us, it gives us a warning. Just like your cousins, if they've had too much to drink, they give you a warning before they, start swinging. We treat them like cousins, they treat us like cousins. When you understand the appropriate familial relationship, you understand how you can successfully move through this world. So all of nature, all of this world around us, is one big interconnected web of relationships. What we would call the human world, the natural world of animals, physical objects, and what we would call the supernatural world. I say supernatural world and what we would call because just like there is no native term for religion, there's generally not a Native American term for supernatural either. The idea that there is this one realm of nature and another realm that is somehow different from that, called supernature, is just not a part of the indigenous worldview. There's the part of the world that we interact with on an everyday basis, the mundane world, and then there's that part that we don't always see and don't always interact with, but it is just a part of this one unified, holistic cosmos as anything else. When things go wrong in this world, when things go wrong within a community, when things go wrong within a person, it is because in some way, one of these relationships has gone out of whack. It's the job of those experienced in religious knowledge, those who have been trained with religious ceremony, to be able to identify what relationships have gone out of harmony and seek to rebalance them. Authority, who has power, the structures of society, gender roles, leadership, all of these are examples of relationships that are supported by and justified by Native American religion. The things that we need to do as a society, farm, hunt, come together and be one people, all of these are things that are informed, supported, created, justified by religion. Negotiating change, yet another key element of religion, whether we be talking about Native American religions or any religion. Religion helps us identify when there's change going on, helps us to understand it, helps us to make it happen. Whether it be making a better world, whether it be making ourselves healed when we are sick. Religion helps us to negotiate from one state of existence to another, from a state of sickness to a state of health, from a state of sinfulness to a state of redemption. Religion helps you to heal yourself from one state to another, and that's going to be the closest thing we have to a universal across all religions. Religions heal. As much as they might give rise to hatred and antagonism and war and violence, religions heal. Healing is the heart of Native American religions as well. I wanted to talk about restorative justice, but you needed to understand that concept of relationality, to understand it within the Native community. We in the West have a tendency of thinking of justice as retributive, that when a crime is done, that there was a law broken. A law broken means that a certain punishment is due. So our job is to establish that the crime was actually committed and then seek to mete out the proper punishment, sort of retribution or vengeance. Restorative justice is based off of a Native American concept of relationality. When harm is done, it doesn't really matter that for us to try to prove who did it, who's at fault. When harm is done, it is because something has become out of balance. Something is not right. And so we should seek to restore that balance and harmony within the community. Whenever any harm is done towards a person or towards a group, restorative justice seeks to restore the balance and the happiness and the peace of the community. In the case of one offender or harm bringer, bringing another person to harm, restorative justice seeks to ameliorate both parties, as well as the community itself, which suffered from the harm being committed. So in a case of what we might call a crime, you meet with the person who perpetuated the harm. Why did they do it? Chances are there's something broken within them, something that they are crying out in need of help with. You help the offender. Chances are the person who has received the harm is in need of some sort of retribution, some sort of reparative services, whether it be money or counseling. And the community itself needs to be addressed in the wake of this harm. And then once you've addressed all three individually, you bring all three into conversation, and the three in conversation with each other seek to figure out what safeguards need to be put in place, what action plan needs to be created to recognize that harm has been committed and to heal the damage done. That's a plan that's worked out between the one who perpetuates the harm and the one who has received the harm and the community that houses them both. This is an idea that exists within Native American communities from before European contact, and it's just started to grow a little bit more acceptable to be discussed within larger jurisprudence communities. I guess that's a word, right? Mm-hmm. Jurisprudential, there we go. Make it fancier. Jurisprudential communities. People are actually talking about restorative justice. This is a Native American religious concept. If this community is wanting to talk about racial equity, what is the idea of equity but fixing an imbalanced situation, an inequity that has been done in the past, that we are finding ourselves facing? Matters less who is at fault, but perhaps this model of restorative justice might offer a way forward, where all of those communities that have been affected by this harm could try to make the next couple of steps. So there's a lot more that if you actually want to know about restorative justice that you can find out about, but I'm definitely not going to talk about it up here, in part because it's long and dry and boring, but also because finding out about it is part of the process. If this is something that you think we as a community, this community could benefit from, that you think the Native American community around us could benefit from, then the beginning of the process of researching it is the first step in healing this community. Finding out about restorative justice, what could be done, what sort of obligations and duties would everyone be looking at? That's the first steps of healing. So, that said, I am officially 3 minutes over time, so I wanted that to be the focus because now we can open it up and actually have a conversation about any of these issues, or more general, what do you want to know about Native American religion, which always works better in an open forum with question and answer than it does with just me lecturing.
And the microphones are on the table, so today you just ask questions.
Excellent.
Regarding the 1978 law and artifacts, recently, this last week on NPR, they were talking about bones and skeletons and so forth. But had you heard about that the FBI in 2014 found a man in Indiana that had 500 sets, not 500 bones, 2,000 bones of Native people? And they felt that he has passed away, and his wife won't talk about it, but they suspect that he's gone to like effigy mounds and raided effigy mounds. But 500 sets of Native people.
I hadn't heard that story. As disparaging and disgusting as it is for us today, it was extremely common. In fact, the birth of the field of archaeology went hand in hand with the excavation of effigy mounds. It was a hobby in Wisconsin. It was what you would do after church on a Sunday. You would go a mounding. People would bring picnic lunch, and after church services, they would have a picnic, and they would dig up an effigy mound, and it was considered fun for the family. But it was the white settler obsession with who could have built these mounds? Because it was understood it couldn't have been the natives because they were primitive and savage. It had to have been some other culture. And it was that question of who that actually motivated scientific interest to eventually begin the modern fields of archaeology and convince the Smithsonian to begin to create a subboard of ethnography to actually start studying native people. Horrible time. That led to some decent stuff.
Well, is that significantly different than what primarily Europeans? Is that significantly different than what Europeans did in Egypt or in other cultures?
Oh, no. It's the same time period. You watched Indiana Jones movies or the Mummy movies, right? That time period where we were going around, traipsing around to all of those places where we would bring our European colonialism and start to unearth their natural resources, their historical treasures, right? We were doing it in Europe, we were doing it in Assyria and Babylonia, we were doing it in Asia, same time we were doing it here. So the British origin of archaeology has a lot to do with Egypt. The American origin emerged in conversation, but largely independent. So it was the mounds that here really motivated scientific interest. It was Egypt for British archaeologists.
On the restorative justice, I don't know if you're aware, but here in Madison-Dane County has a restorative justice. It's like a department within the human services or something like that. And last November, I went through a training session for people who would be participants, and I mean it was a big group of people. I've not since then I've not been called, but the concept is that they train you on being a peacemaker, and then when they have an offender, and they have a different term, a more neutral term, and I can't remember what it is, who is offered the option. You have the option of either going through this process or you can go to a regular judge. And it's obviously it's for less serious offenses. It tends to be burglaries and theft and things like that. And what they do then is they bring that person who has committed the offense, and they are interviewed. The victim is interviewed, and then the people who work at this program, then they select people from the peacemaker group that they feel would be appropriate, and they bring any family members of both parties into this circle, and it's a circle, and you go through a process of listening. So the person who offended has to listen to the victim, and the victim, there's mutual conversation, and then people around the circle also offer that you are, as a peacemaker, you are a representative of the community, and you are to talk about how the community has been broken by what that person did. And then eventually the people in that circle provide, they come up with This is what your restitution is going to be. You're accountable.
I had no idea that there was such a subgroup in human services, you said?
Yeah, it's sort of in the human service. It's not in the justice department. But there's one here in Dane County and there's one over in Milwaukee County.
It's becoming increasingly common since the late 1970s. We've started to see them popping up throughout the country. It's been a part of tribal courts since as long as there's been tribal sovereignty. But just now they've been starting to get integrated into the larger judicial system. And again, just as you said, as an option for certain, as we would say, offenders to take. It seems like it would be the easy way out, right? Sit around, talk about things, but it ends up being in some ways more transformative, and in that way more serious than simply spending some weeks or months of your life in a prison.
Well, and they have to listen to how that hurt that person.
Yeah.
And they have to listen to the other community people. This is how you have offended, broken our society.
It has powerful potential.
I have a different topic. We've often talked about how we like how the Native American relationship of being in relationship with nature and with each other and with all of it and with God as all being one entity. And I really think that is what that's what I think that Genesis is about, is that we are all part of creation and we all live in that and we are all in relationship with each other. And somehow, through hierarchy, we've lost that.
It's somewhat meaningful that the most common type of Native American origin story isn't the origin of the earth. Most Native peoples actually don't have a story of the creation of the earth. It's the story of where we as a people came from. But of those that actually have a creation story, most of them have human beings in some way coming from earth. Again, that idea that we are of the same stuff that gives rise to animals and plants,
And often
creates us.
connected to some animal.
Yeah.
Often.
I just really appreciate your beginning your underlayment of where people came from, where the Native American came, and the influence of various countries, religions saw themselves in relation to those who were already inhabiting the land. That was very interesting. It has been interesting for me, having lived in Africa a couple years and been connected with refugees recently, how family relationships and names are so important to how they treat each other, like you were saying. So our Bhutanese refugees with whom we became connected in 2010, the first connection, I'm not sure they even heard our names, but they called us within just a couple hours Grandma and Grandpa, and still do not call us by our names. And I thought, that's been very special from the beginning, but it also says relationship is of prime importance, and they refer to many within their culture as being, well, that's my brother. Well, is that your dad's brother or your mother's? No, that's just my brother or my uncle or my cousin. And I think it is when we see ourselves in relationship as being patriarchal and matriarchal, we have a different relationship and purpose for our being, and how we then work out a restorative justice. Also in Africa, when someone died within the family, if there were people that had left that village or that community for work or some other reason must return to that village, partly in defense. I had nothing to do with the death of that person. I don't know about it, but it was important for the community to come together in not just in sympathy, but in a bonding and a relationship being.
I think that's important. Something that I didn't highlight as much as I wanted it to be implicit. Part of the unseen violence or difficulty, part of the unseen inequity, is trying to force Native people to enter into Euro-American constructs to seek to assert some sort of reparation or demand for justice, to somehow appeal to our sense of what religion is so that they can seek to claim religious liberty. They have to subvert their concept to ours. To be able to find repatriation of their ancestors' bones, they have to demonstrate a connection to that person using the standards and the science of white Euro-Americans. Right? They have to demonstrate to our standards and our credentials, our criteria. So when trying to talk about restorative justice, when talking about justice and inequity, when talking about kinship, kinship has always been more about community than about blood. Throughout the world, this notion that kin is somehow blood is a very modern concept. And so the idea that these people, a people, should seek to be recognized by the United States government by appealing to our sort of requisition of blood quota, requiring that a person meet some sort of abstract amount of Native American blood in order to be treated appropriately, to be able to be seen as a victim of this harm, it continues to perpetuate the harm. To try to expect some sort of idea of repatriation, some sort of idea of reconciliation that comes from our justice system or from our religious worldview might be doing the same.
I'd like you to continue on that line to some degree. That at the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about sort of worldview, and that and that Christian worldview was based on a monogenetic understanding of origins, and that I just recently read an article that said, that it was presumed, of course, that white were superior, and that Africans they could become white if they just moved north and stayed north long enough. And the evidence of that was that you could tell that Egyptians were lighter than those in South Africa, and so therefore, if you just kept moving north, that you'd be assimilated eventually, and that the Asians were untrustworthy and the Laplanders were just crazy. But that if you would move to a more temperate climate like Europe, that all these people had the opportunity of becoming assimilated. And it was not until Columbus encountered the Los Indios in the New World that it was the first time that Europe had encountered a non-biblical people. And so then they came up with this whole hypothesis of polygenesis, which allowed for a hierarchical structure of superiority being better and that other classes being less. So, and this is going to most of the work that John Locke and David Hume and Cotton Mather did was all based on assimilation. But Native American understanding of reconciliation, can you talk something about the difference between assimilation and reconciliation.
Sure, sure. Kind of have a little throw out to Locke, though, since you mentioned him. John Locke, who gave us a further elaboration of that idea of consent of the governed, and this idea that we're all born equal, right, equally devoid of experience, equal in the state of nature. No one's born inherently more powerful or authoritative than the other. Foundation work for a lot of sort of liberation concepts. He also helped to reify the concepts of race. He actually inserted into the colony of Carolinas a clause in their company charter that said that a slave doesn't get to be not a slave just because they convert. Whereas before, the idea of religion was so tied to race that essentially if an African were to convert to Christianity, they would kind of be less black. And therefore, we could not really justify keeping them enslaved because really we're just keeping them enslaved to teach them Christianity. But then once we start appealing to reason and science, then it can become, well, there actually is some sort of genetic or biological difference, and then they are in fact inferior. And the authority that John Locke spoke of as being unnatural, the absolute authority that's unnatural, that's a king's authority is unnatural. White authority, totally natural for him. And again, sort of genetically based. As for Native American reconciliation versus, what was the other word you said? Assimilation. Most Native American communities have a concept of adoption. It's one of the core rituals of the Lakota, for example, one of the 7 sacred ceremonies at the heart of their ceremonial complex. And it's a ceremony that's there for the making of relatives, that a person, not of us, can undergo this ceremony and they become a part of this kinship network. It allowed fragments of people in the past to come together and be reunited as one people, stronger than either group, or for one person to come into this community and become a member, which is if you ever hear about concepts of like a white man being adopted into a native tribe, this was possible. The person wouldn't be white. The very concept of whiteness was foreign to most native communities, as was the concept of Indianness. It's not going to be until the 1800s that we see Native American communities actually accepting that term Indian and claiming it and making it their own. Say, whereas before we thought ourselves the Sauk or the Lakota or the Menominee, and we thought of ourselves as distinct people, you call us Indian, and yes, we are all Indian, because we have all had this shared experience of being sort of persecuted by you. And so if we are all Indian, then together as Indian, let us join together in resistance. It's a movement we call the Pan-Indian movement, as that idea of Indianism began to draw disparate communities together. This idea of adoption, though, this idea of being able to reconcile 2 different communities and somehow make them one, was what made that entire unification process possible. White, Indian, black were terms that would pop up in that Pan-Indian movement, as was the notion of separate creations. If so much of white racism was based on the idea that they were somehow descendants of Jews or descendants of people that were somehow inferior, Native Americans pushed back by embracing some parts of that Christian message, maybe like an idea of one God and an idea of a creator God. We'll take that, but modify it a bit. So maybe there was a God that created, in which case maybe he created you, white people, and gave you your way, which is Christianity. And our God, that same God, created us, Indians, and he gave us our way. And just as it would be wrong for you to follow our way, it is wrong for us to follow yours. And so this religion became a sort of foundation to resist forced conversions and white imperialism. Not exactly sure if that got to what you were wanting to talk about. But
Close.
is there any way I can get some more at it? No? Okay.
Well, I just want to make a comment about the religion thing, which you were just talking about, of how it seems to me that the Second Amendment is really all about you can all be Christian and you can't keep you from being Catholic or Quaker. But man, when you start talking about being Jewish or Islam or Native American or having something really that's not Christian, then we really struggle with that.
Right.
Absolutely, it's
Yeah.
super hard.
I pulled up the quote because I figured it would come up. When, of course, with the Board of Indian Commissioners, right, you have United States of America with this idea of religious freedom. And here we have the outlawing of a religion. How do you reconcile that? The board said, quote, "The Indians have a right under the Constitution, as much as any other person in the Republic, to the full enjoyment of liberty of conscience. Accordingly, they have the right to choose whatever Christian belief they want, without interference of the government." Yeah.
I have, oh, wait.
I don't know whether it's okay, I don't know whether it's restorative justice or not, but it seems recent to me that I've been hearing courts having victim impact statements. Is that now an attempt by our justice system to move towards what you're calling restorative justice?
It is. It's restorative justice shading into our justice system. It's somehow less ideal. I would say it's probably less as effective as the full restorative justice model, but it's allowing, in some way, exactly that, allowing greater conversation between the parties. Advocates of restorative justice would say that it's a good first step, but we feel far more free to express ourselves using verbal language than we do prepared statements. And we really need to be able to ultimately bring these parties together and allow them to communicate rather than just have scripts. But yeah, apparently, and this is something I'm just finding out about myself, that is a slow introduction of some of these principles that we find sort of acceptably mainstream.
I have three things, if I remember all of them in order. But when you were talking about the 1883 ban on Native religions, which I didn't know anything about, but this summer in preparation for a trip to the Black Hills, we reread Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was, you can't read that without.
It's devastating.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. But I wondered, was there a connection with the ghost dance and Americans being fearful of the power of that experience?
Yeah. The Board of Indian Commissioners created agents that they would send to each reservation to observe and police the local reservation, make sure that the commission's rules were being enforced. These agents were primarily white Christians, and they were nearly obsessed with dancing. Dancing to them was sort of the epitome of Native American savagery and their non-Christianity, right? In some way, it is this physical activity that is almost animalistic to their eyes, so very not civilized, plus it's allowing them to keep alive their non-Christian ways. So there was a strong move to try to repress Native American dance. And the ban was focused on outlawing dance, practice, performance of any way. And sort of the outlawing of religion was sort of secondary to that. We stopped the practice first. And central to that was the practice of the dance, which at that time was initially the sun dance, which was found within a lot of southwestern cultures, Lakota, Dakota, probably the most famous. That was outlawed. The ghost dance of 1870 and the ghost dance of 1890, which there are two ghost dances, and they're not the same thing, because historians, I guess, aren't good at making different names. They were attempts by different Native communities to find a ritual that allowed them to come together across cultural and religious boundaries, a new innovative ritual that we could both practice together, and that allowed them to make sense of the loss of power in the community and the misfortune that we are currently experiencing. Many included sort of a look towards the future, a hope, an anticipation of some sort of better day on the horizon. Of course, since dancing was against the law, these Native communities would have to practice it away from the observation of agents or prying white eyes. Well, if we don't get to see what they're doing, how do we know what they're doing? How do we know they're not trying to plot some sort of rebellion or some sort of revolt? Maybe they're trying to start a war and they're going to wipe out and try to kill all white people. If it seems ridiculous, it's exactly what the newspapers were printing back east. People began to hear that there was some sort of thing, a dance movement happening among Native people, that different peoples were moving from one reservation to another to engage in some sort of ceremony. What they're doing, we don't know, but of course, this is the height of yellow journalism. So they began to print all of these fear-mongering stories. And white America begins to fear that these ghost dances are the prelude to a coming war, which leads to the sending in of the cavalry, which leads to the massacre of Wounded Knee, and yeah, directly connected.
Thank you. If somebody else has a question, I don't want to hog your time. The second one was I recently read William Cronin, who is, you know him, and his writing on New England, I cannot recall the title of that, but really spoke to exactly what you were talking about in the making of fences, talking about how they all came over and thought that that was the right thing to do, and it totally, of course, destroyed the land because what the Native people were doing and what we now call no-till farming, which, if we had paid attention, we would have been doing for the last 300 and 400 years, but but it took these white settlers 400 years to get to what was actually made sense.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I have a question related to that. I was just excited to hear you talking about that and say, oh, that's what I read about.
It goes to this sort of framing concept of our worldview, right? That religion is intimately tied to, right? The settlers didn't see what Native people were doing to the land because they couldn't, right? To them, you could only improve land in one way. If you weren't doing that, you weren't doing anything to it. So they didn't see the difference. They, at first, didn't even see Native American religion. When Christopher Columbus came here, his definition of religion was creed and church. And he looked among Native Americans and he found no written creed, and he found no established church. So he said, therefore, Native Americans have no religion. Like, he just could not perceive that it might be something other. Farming technique's the same, right? That's just not farming.
Well, when you're talking about dancing and music, one of the, I think it was in February, there was a program, an independent film on PBS called Rumble, and it was about how Native Americans in the Trail of Tears, some of them had hidden off in with the slaves and become integrated in the black community, and that many of the really great drummers that came along later came from this Cree background, and we thought it was really interesting and fun to watch. So you can catch Rumble out of PBS. It's just, I had no idea that that had happened, and that when you start listening to drumming from the point of view of Native drumming, of course, it's right there. But it was really a neat movie. On the dark side, last night we watched the Frontline report on the doctor out in Pine Ridge who they finally arrested and sentenced for abusing young boys on reservations for a long time. When you talk about restorative justice, I think that was our first thought after we watched this thing, is somebody needs to help those young men who are all in prison now. And it's just heartbreaking. So it's a front line on doctor abuse of people on the reservations. It was just kind of indicative of all the things you're talking about that we've done to our Native American brothers and sisters. heartbreaking.
The picture on the slide that I have on, when talking about the boarding schools, was actually taken off of the website of a restorative justice group that's emerged among several Native American communities seeking to address the damage done by boarding schools. It's a group that's trying to get the survivors to begin to share their stories, to recognize that first they have experienced harm. So many people have been physically or sexually abused, certainly emotionally abused, but not even everyone remembers or can admit it. So the first step is to recognize, get the people who have experienced the harm to identify that they have had harm. And then you can get those who have committed the harm to try to identify that they have perpetuated harm.
One
But
thing
this
they-
is-
oh, go ahead.
But this is not an American phenomenon. You would find the same stories in Canada. You'd find the same stories in Australia. It was very much part of the, hate to blame a single place, but the way the English dealt with their colonial and then adopted, of course, by the Americans and Canadians and whatever. So we're not unique. We may have sophisticated it to a certain extent, but Canada is also dealing with this on a profound basis.
Oh, yeah. I left the Canada part of the conversation out just because, well, America. Because it's a part of the story that most people don't care to know. But yeah, Canada has experienced much the same. Their religious freedom and the movement towards restoration, the movement towards religious freedom, has happened a little bit different time. It's been a little bit more public. It's been a little bit more intentional. It still hasn't had a whole lot come from it. But at least there's been more lip service paid towards it, which is something. Australia's worse. Whereas here we had the war policy for an extended period of time, Australia involved death camps, essentially. The war policy, quote unquote, there would have been far more intensive. And while many Native American communities today are living in conditions that are worse than third world, those Aboriginal territories are in the same boat. Many, however, are more separated from places where they could get services. Native American reservations are often in the middle of nowhere, right? The land that no one else wanted and was classified as subprime, submarginal, my apologies, submarginal lands, which means to get to a place that is more built up, where you could get the health services or the human services that the community might need, you have to travel quite some way. Australia is really freaking big, and it's only really densely inhabited on the eastern side, whereas most of those lands that Aboriginals have been forced to are further away. So it's even more difficult to try to move towards a better future there. But no, this is a legacy that all European descended countries get to face. The story is different in different places, but it's not better anywhere.
If you have research projects going on about Indigenous people, can you share information with what you're working on?
Oh, sure. Let's see, what do I have going on right now? I just finished up my last project on the origin of the Effigy Mounds, which we spoke about a little bit at the last library talk, and will be the subject of a future library talk. I've been coerced to revive an old project in which I'll be talking about the religious revolt of 1680. It's the Pueblo revolt of 1680, the largest, most successful Native American revolt, kicked the Spanish out of colonial New Mexico for 20 years. It was an intensive and violent revolt that was inseparable from the largely pacifistic religion of the people. In some way, it's able to be both. And I'll be sort of looking in and telling that story. And I have another project that's driving me down south. It's very different. It's a study of an indigenous religious group, but not Native American. I've made some connections with a local neo-pagan group down in southern Louisiana. People who are seeking to revive what they believe are the indigenous religions of their people, by which they mean their European ancestors. It's going to be an interesting story because, of course, most neo-pagan revivals tend to have a pretty heavy theme of white supremacy. And yet these people are from southern Louisiana and have adopted into their religious practice voodoo loa, who they claim as theirs and their spirit. I don't know what to say about this yet, but there's something to be said. Exactly. That's up next.
I have a quick question, Mike. Yeah. I want to thank you. I learned a lot this evening. I'm just wondering if looking back on the expanse of history, if there were some moments where it could have gone a different way. And I'm thinking of moments when I know it got worse, right? I'm thinking of Prince Philip's War. I'm thinking of Bacon's Rebellion. And both of these are times in which the conflict between the European colonizers and indigenous peoples, became much worse. And these were also times in which the economic development or future economic development seemed to shift in a different way. So the white laborers, for example, that's the usual way in which Bacon's Rebellion is understood in Virginia, where the white workers become empowered to also be the militia pushing back the native peoples. So I think of those moments as times when, boy, that's where it got worse. Things looked bad. I'm just wondering if there were times in which things could have gone a different way.
101 different ways.
Andrew Jackson would have followed the Constitution and obeyed the Supreme Court decision.
Oh,
That would have made there would not have been a Trail of Tears, but we had an imperial president.
yeah. I will not disagree with that. We, as a nation, made so many treaties wherein we recognize that there is a problem here. Let us come together. Let us create some sort of establishment for future relations. Which had we held to pretty much any of those, right? When there was the relocation of Native people west of the Mississippi River, that was supposed to be the Native American treaty to end all treaties. We agreed to make a line of forts running from our north to south that were supposed to be facing towards the east. The goal of the fort was not to stop Native American incursion, it was to stop white people from going and settling on native land. We just didn't do it. When there was an act of resistance from one Native American community, it would have been easy for the leader of a military, whether it be a general or a local captain, to actually respond appropriately. Maybe seek to put down that act of violence, as opposed to what we know happened in so many rebellions, including those in Wisconsin, where the military would see, well, in this move to squash this rebellion, we will eliminate the Native American villages and people here, regardless of if they are the same people or if they are participating, which then has devastating ripple effects. There were so many instances where presidents would say something, would put an idea forward that actually could have led to some sort of better relationship between America and the Native people. Native peoples who were affirmed again and again in rhetoric as being sovereign, worthy of respect, worthy perhaps of shepherding like small children. So there was still racism, but still worthy of respect and sovereignty. And had that rhetoric been then reflected in the actions? In so many ways, things could have gone different if just one person in the right place in the right room could have been there. But we don't know.
I'm also really intrigued about your presenting for us that model of restorative justice and say, do your homework, because that really puts, that's really a cool challenge. I really appreciate that, because there's so much that could be done if we take that as a religious community really seriously about how do you restore relationships that have been broken. And that's not easy, and as you led us to, it requires patient dialogue, listening, and really listening and hearing. But what an intriguing concept.
I wish I could claim that as my own, but no, that comes from a Native American community who is encouraging this very thing, restorative justice. And as much as it encourages getting this idea out there, makes it clear that if you as a speaker or if you as an advocate want to suggest this to the community, the first step can't be you just standing up and telling the community about it. It has to be hopefully generating a will within the community for them to begin the self-process of growth. This is just one way that I try to allow Native communities to speak as much as possible when I'm up here, because I identify as white. Regardless of heritage or what biology might say, my parents identify as white, I identify as white, and I've grown up my entire life experiencing all of the privileges and undeserved merits that come along with that. So when I come up here to speak about Native people, it is sort of my moral obligation to try to bring in Native perspectives and Native voices as much as possible. And that includes this idea of restorative justice and the first step, the invitation for personal growth.
Lutherans have apologized for Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, but I don't know if we've apologized for any of this history, have we? I don't know.
You have a wonderful declaration on repudiation of the doctrine of discovery.
Yes.
One of the few, exactly, the origin of this committee, and one of the few denominations that has actually rejected that. It is worth noting that the doctrine of discovery, while seen as lamentable by the American government, is still accepted as the foundation of our jurisdiction. The Supreme Court ruled that, yes, this is problematic, there is no justification for it, done is done, we're here, let's move forward. So the doctrine of discovery is the foundation still for future American justice.
And when was that decided?
That was 1850s, if I recall.
That was Marshall?
I believe it was.
Okay.
Good memory.
And nothing since then?
No, that still stands. How can we claim to be a just society? Well, we have to have a just foundation. And people questioned it. It wasn't emerging from the Native American community either. It was white lawyers. But people analyzed this whole idea of international law, the law of nations, the doctrine of discovery, said that, yes, this was made on some false assumptions. That's made by those British, who are, of course, our ancestors. While they might have made a mistake, they made some errors. We have inherited the authority that they created from those errors. So now it's just up to us to move forward. So
I want to say one quick thing about that. In our Bible study, we're talking about Genesis. And something we don't think about is when Abram moved into this land, there were people living there. The exact same thing. God gave him this land, and last week we were doing the thing where he and Lot divvied it up, and you stand over here and everything you can see is yours, and I'll stand over here and everything that I can see is mine. But there's already people living in all that land, but now it's mine.
That's something when I do my story of Judaism. I tell the story of the emergence of the Hebrew people. And when they come out of the wilderness into that land that God has given to them, there's just one problem. All the darn Canaanites, right? All the people who have been living there for centuries, who believe this is the land of their fathers and their fathers' fathers, because it had been. And the resulting long, slow war of conquest is in some ways a result of that.
And then we were watching Ken Burns, and he says, history doesn't repeat itself, but people act the same no matter when.
Like that idea. It's so easy to look at the past and imagine people in the past as being somehow less self-aware than us, somehow less able to see what is right and wrong, or that they were blind in some way. It's more difficult, though, to take that same realization and try to turn it on ourselves to ask, in what ways are we still that blind? And what are we still perpetuating ignorances?
So at the beginning of your presentation, we were talking about the land bridge. So were you suggesting that there's another point of entry, or that a separate Genesis? That's question number one. And that I mean, I always love the Mormons' lost tribes of Israel. That, you know, you talk to Jewish people, they never lost those people. They always knew where they were.
But the Mormons know that is what happened.
Absolutely. First part, I was not trying to propose an alternative. It's just, I just wanted to point out that that for us is sufficient to the question, where did they come from? Which we could have answered that question so many different ways. But just a vague reference to a land bridge, it brings them in connection to the rest of humanity, and it affirms for us that there is still one humanity, one creation. So we're still looking and doing the same thing as Christopher Columbus was, but using the same idea that there is one humanity and sort of presenting or projecting our worldview on everything we're seeing. Although I didn't mean to suggest that there is an alternative point. There actually was probably alternative points of entry. South America, it's very well known. If people came over the land bridge and then migrated south over time, civilization starts in South America and it moves north, right? The first major cities and civilized or complex societies start in South America, then through Central America, then into North America. Same for maize production and agriculture. Starts in the south, moves up. Which it could just have people have moved south and then the culture have come up. But you had people founding Polynesian islands, heading off towards a horizon with nothing but a firm religious belief that there was an island over there, whether they had experienced it or not. There's no reason to doubt that they could have similarly have come here and landed in South America.
You're presupposing that the Mayan or the Inca culture was superior to the North American.
It's not superior, larger and more complex.
Well, you're saying civilized versus whatever. So, I mean,
Civilized means living in cities. Civilized as in civitas, Latin, it means city dwelling. So yeah, literally, in anthropology, a civilized culture is one who lives in a sedentary, large, stratified society, city dwelling. And the first cities we have are in South America, then in Central America, then in North America. In terms of better or worse, no. Who's to say that a larger community is somehow better than a smaller community?
People who live in cities.
Exactly. Same way that we say that our technology is somehow superior to that technology. No, it's more complex. It doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
Until you have to use it.
I don't know. I can I can teach someone to use a bow and arrow in an afternoon, and you'll be at least hitting the target. It's hard to teach someone to use a handgun and have that same rate of accuracy so quickly. See, technology gets more complex over time, not necessarily better.
But genetically, there was a thing on just recently about genetically, these people, the people of the Americas all have similar genetic codes, which comes from like India and China, but not either one. And somehow coming up across there, they turned into a different people, and they are unique. They are not like Asians, and they are not like Indians. They are different, which is what Native American people have always said. We are unique and different, and genetically they seem to be, that seems to be true.
Sure.
Which is interesting.
Also how we categorize people, right? Because we in this room are genetically different from everyone who's outside. And if we looked, we would be able to find some sort of statistically meaningful way in which this random handful of people are somehow genetically different from all other people. It's a matter of how you group them and what you go looking for. So yeah, Native Americans are different from non-Native Americans, but is that the meaningful category? Or is that just we grouped this group of people together and looked for a commonality? It's a larger question of, is race a real biological thing, or is it just us grouping people together and looking for some sort of commonality?
But are you saying race is genetic?
No, I'm saying just the
No, see,
opposite.
I wouldn't see that genetically the same would make you racially.
Right. There is far more genetic variation within a given race than among them. So yeah, it is a cultural category. So you had a question about migration over, what was your second question, sir?
What was that? It was migration over the land bridge, and you asked if there were other alternatives. Yeah. Yeah.
Whether that rather than land bridge, that there was a separate creation.
Oh, right, yeah. No, well, anything is possible until proven otherwise, but our scientific evidence from anthropology to biogenetics seems to imply some sort of a connection to the rest of humanity and some sort of singular origin.
I realize scientifically,
Right.
but religiously.
Religiously. Well, until Pan-Indianism, Native Americans really had no desire to articulate singular creation. It's the story of where our people came from, not where human beings came from. And so it was simply not a part of most Native religions. Mormonism. That was the thing I wanted to get back to. The whole Mormon concept that somehow Native peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. When that came out in the 1800s, when the Book of Mormon was published, it actually didn't say anything that most Americans didn't already believe. It just gave more details. Most Americans at the time already believed that somehow Native Americans were descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. That was not an invention of, or an innovation of Mormonism. It just gave more details about the story of how that might have happened. It's one of the reasons that Mormonism grew into a religion so quickly from the first publication of the book. The book read so like what general Protestant Christians would have thought would have happened, right?
Where did the idea of the lost tribes of Israel come from?
Well, after Israel splits into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, Israel gets sacked by the Assyrians in 722. And leaving only Judah behind. Well, Israel did not split neatly. Most of the 12 tribes, 10 of the 12 tribes were in the north, 2 of the 12 tribes were in the south. And so when Assyria conquered Israel, those 10 tribes disappear. They're not really talked about in the later scriptures. and they disappear from our archaeological record. Now, in all likely, it's because they just intermarried with the Syrians and they became Assyrians, right? That's just it. We never technically know. And so come the age of discovery, as Europeans are traipsing across the globe and conquering it, they had to, in some way, find a way to connect these people in different ways to that scriptural narrative that they knew. And so they evoked that notion of the lost tribes of Israel again and again. Even today, we have the same word. We drop the word of Israel, but you'll see National Geographic publish an article every couple of years on some new quote-unquote lost tribe that was found. There's still a placeholder idea in our worldview that there's somehow a people out there that are somehow disconnected from the larger story, the notion of a lost tribe. And it's connected to this myth of the lost tribes of Israel.
I think we could continue on and on and on, so we'll just respect the time. Unless there's any last burning question, we'll say thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for all of you, there are some sheets out there about the next session, so finally you can think ahead and put some things on your calendar. And because these are so valuable, please, in your congregations, bring along another 6 or 8 people. Because we know from sitting here, we should have had this place packed. Yeah.